If you've been with us, you know that we have been journeying through the book of First Kings together, and especially in this section or season, looking at the life and rule of King Solomon. And in some ways, that's coming to an end this week and next week. But we have in front of us, again this week, a pretty significant section of text. And it could have been broken up into smaller pieces, but there's a reason for my madness in doing it in one big piece. So we're going to go from chapter 9 all the way to verse 10 of chapter 11. And that means we're obviously not going to read all of it. I'm going to reference different verses. I may or may not call some onto the screen, depending upon how we're kind of processing along. But I really do want you, on the heels of this, to go back and read these chapters and consider what I'm presenting to you today as a collection, because I do think they're meant to be read together and understood together, but I'm going to ask you to trust me on that until we get towards the very end of the sermon, and then hopefully where I go with it, you'll see why they're all meant to be read together and understood together. Make sense? All right, so we're going to read the very end of that and then work backwards, because I do think in some ways it's a little bit like the old illustration of the iceberg. What happens in chapter 11 is the visible sort of representation, but what happens in chapter 9 and 10 is actually describing something that's happening under the surface in Solomon's heart that's going to lead to this collapse. So, 1 Kings chapter 11, I'm going to read the first 10 verses. It says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Held fast literally means clutched or grabbed onto them in love. He had 700 wives, interesting, of royal birth, and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Word of God for the people of God. So we have recorded in these 10 verses the epic collapse of Solomon that the storyteller has been hinting at is going to happen because of his inner corruption. But we have to ask ourselves, how does something like this happen? How are we just 2 chapters away from this epic moment where Solomon builds God a house and God descends in all of his glory, a visible sight for Solomon and all Israel to see? How just 2 chapters later is Solomon now building houses or temples or altars for all of these supposed would-be gods? And what's more, Solomon is not just building them altars. It says he's actually following after them. Right? The word follow is the Hebrew word halak. It means to walk. Right? We've talked about this sometimes before, that in the ancient world, really ancient world of Israel, but even in the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament, the language of walking was used to talk about how one ordered their life, how one lived their life. It was their walk. And so Solomon's walk was after all these gods. So it went from one creator God to God amongst many gods. And this is an epic collapse, an epic failure, and it ought to be utterly stunning to us in its juxtaposition to God's arrival in the temple, and yet not all that surprising because of some of the things that we've seen. But I think in chapter 9, 10, and beginning of 11, what the storyteller is actually setting forth for us is the reason this actually happened, right? Not just the sneak peeks he had been giving us into the brokenness in Solomon, but now he's actually going to lay out a very significant case, as it were, for how something like this happens. And here's what I would suggest to us this morning. That we, like Solomon, are broken humanity and always only a few steps away from epic collapse. And so we need to really dig into this story and attempt to understand what's happening here so that we can learn from it and understand what it means to walk with the Lord and not walk with other gods. So what I want to do is pause. I want to pray again because I think this is heavy and ask God to teach us this morning. God, what is before us is heavy, and we are aware of our own personal brokenness. And so we ask in this next 30 minutes or so that you would speak clearly to us. I pray that you would speak collectively to us from the Scriptures. But then, Spirit, as only you can do, we pray that you would speak individually to each of us in the way in which we need to process this morning. So have your way with us, we ask. I pray that I would not stand in the way in any way. And I ask it in your name. Amen. So, how does such an epic collapse happen? Or, writ small, how does sin happen? How does rebellion against God happen? And it absolutely is a heart issue. So if we read only chapter 11, as many people do, there's a singular answer, right? The storyteller tells us he married 1,000 foreign women, and they led him astray. But if you're going to just say that and stop there, you're going to miss the whole thing. And so we need to pause and deal with that. But then we're going to start proverbially peeling back the layers of the onion, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There's something else happening going on here that is going to be most instructive to us. A couple things we need to say. I said this earlier in the book of 1 Kings. It's imperative that I say it again. Some people will use a text like this and say, see, God is against interracial marriage or marrying people who are not from your own ethnicity or country or whatever. And I would say to you, I almost want to use a bad word, right? But I would say to you, that is utter nonsense. Is that a fairly Christian way to speak strongly? That if someone says that to you, you probably should never listen to another thing they say, right? That's what I want to tell you, all right? Because that's utter nonsense. What that actually is racism. It's bigotry. In the kingdom of God, interracial marriage across ethnicities or nationalities or whatever, is a beautiful and wonderful thing. It ought to be celebrated. The thing that God is speaking against here is entering into a covenant relationship with someone who is far from Him. You see the difference? That's the instruction happening here. And friends, listen to me. That instruction remains true today. You ought not enter into a covenant relationship with someone who is not worshiping and following, walking with God. If you enter into a covenant relationship with someone who is walking with other gods, right? And of course, those look different in modern day America. you are in for all kinds of struggle, because it is far harder to lift someone up than it is to pull someone down. And this is the story that's going on here. Solomon engages not just with one woman of foreign commitment to God, but 1,000. Now, is this number exact and precise? Who knows? But if it's hyperbole, the point is made, right? This isn't just a couple, right? Solomon has gone headlong into this other direction, and he's given himself to all of these people or things that are far from God and not committed to him. And here's the truth, church. Foreign loves lead to foreign influence. All right? Remember how we've defined foreign. Foreign equals something that is not walking with God, right? Something that is far from God, not in terms of any other modern segment or reality. And so foreign loves, giving our heart in covenant, depth and covenant relationship to things that are far from God, will always lead to foreign influence in our lives. And it says of Solomon, he had a divided heart, right? His heart used to be fully for God, and now it's partly for God, it says. Is that in Solomon's life, there is a divided heart that leads to divided worship, that leads to divided obedience. Here's the truth of the human condition. What we love the most, we worship. And what we worship, we always obey. Okay? Now we have to think in 2025, not just of Shamash and all these other crazy gods of the ancient world, right? We have to think of the gods of our modern world, of which there are just as many. And for many of us, we, like Solomon, are religious pluralists. We love God, and we love all these other gods too. And we're allowing them to have massive influence on our hearts that leads to wrong worship and therefore wrong obedience. Does this make sense? And so it is necessary for us to pause and ask hard questions of our heart. Are there foreign loves in our heart? And take that a different way. Are there wrongly ordered loves in our heart? Because the rest of Scripture also teaches us that we can love good things, non-foreign things to God, but in the wrong order, and therefore get this whole thing messed up again. I love my wife. I'm happy to tell you Rachel walks with God. She is not foreign to God, but every once in a while I can mix up the order of my loves. And it's right and good for me to love Rachel and lay my life down for her. It is wrong for me to worship her. And yet sometimes I find myself doing that, looking to her for my identity, looking to her for security, looking to her for significance, all of these things. Those are acts of worship. And then what happens? It leads to divided obedience. Who am I going to move towards, Rachel or God? But rightly ordered, my love for Rachel flows out of my love for God because my identity is secure in God and therefore able and willing to love and serve my wife. So we've got love problems in our broken human hearts. There's almost no escaping it, but we've got to be honest about it. We love foreign things too much and too many, right? And we wrongly order our loves a whole lot of times, and it oftentimes leads to wrong obedience. And so it is here for Solomon as well. And we could stop there and say that's the answer, right? But really we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that we love foreign things? What is it that leads us to wrongly order our loves or to love the wrong things? How do we get to that place? And I would suggest to you the storyteller has been building that story through chapter 9 and 10 with hints of it from chapter 1 all the way up to this moment. Really, in chapter 3, you remember the profound statement about Solomon. He loved God. And now we're in 11. His love for God was divided. And those are meant to be bookends of this bigger unit. So what happens? Well, here's what I want to suggest to you. That foreign loves exude foreign influence because misplaced glory leads to misplaced priorities. Right? Misplaced glory leads to misplaced priorities. Now, I'm using the word glory on purpose because it's the word that's going to get used a bunch of times in chapter 9 and 10 of 1 Kings, but let's modernize that word. Let's make sense of it for us today. The word glory in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word kavod, right? And really what it means is heavy, weighty, because in the ancient world, things were valued by how much they weighed, right? They didn't have numbers on the front of them like our modern currency. You weighed things, and so gold, you weighed it, and by the weight of it was more significant than the weight of other gold. And so this word kavod is really about glory, which equals worth. Does that make sense? What we find worth in and what we value the most is what we glorify. Does that make sense? What we give glory to is what we value the most or what we find our value in. And wrongly placed or found glory will lead to wrong priorities because we are all looking for value. And what you find in chapter 9 through 10 is Solomon moving from finding glory in God and valuing God above all things to finding it in himself and in his things. So 3 major categories to sort of sum up chapter 9 and 10 would be this. The first is that Solomon amasses wealth and power. Okay? Now this is really important as we jump into this to remember that in chapter 3 and 4, Solomon also amassed wealth and power. But it was talked about very differently in chapter 3 and 4. Almost always in chapter 3 and 4, when it talked about that, it talked also about the glory of God and the prosperity of the land. So there was this sense of Solomon as a steward of God's blessing for all of the people of God, and that this prosperity of the land brought glory to God as it was meant to. But when you get to chapter 9 and 10, there is much more specifics about the prosperity and not any talk about the bounty for the land or the people, and not really any talk except for a foreign queen about the glory of the God who enabled it. And there is a shift going on. And you have to look at some little hints that the storyteller gives us. So let's talk about amassing wealth. It says that Solomon's yearly intake of gold was 666 talents. Now, if you've been hanging around the church for any length of time, that number ought to give you shivers, right? Because we know that that number is a bad number. We might not know why, but we know it's bad. 666, right? We've been taught that that's bad. And there's kind of evil, fleshly, satanic components to this. Again, is this the exact number of talents that Solomon took in? It's possible. But absolutely, the storyteller is making a definitive point here that all of a sudden this bounty has turned from glorifying God to Solomon owning it for his own possession. Let alone, if you read the context of chapter 10, all of this gold is going for Solomon to adorn his palace. He's making all kinds of crazy, enormous golden shields to put up all over his palace. I guess that was a cool thing to do back then, right? His man cave, as it were. And he's building this enormous throne for himself. Now, does a king deserve a throne? I suppose so. But this thing is nuts with ivory and gold and all kinds of stuff going on. So all of this 666 talents of gold are going for Solomon's splendor. Do you see it? And what's more, it says that he was amassing so many horses and chariots that he had to construct whole cities to contain them. Right? So now there are whole cities to contain them. Now, what's important here is to understand a good number of these are not just like, these aren't necessarily forts, like military forts or complexes. Some of it would have been. But also these would have been for royal processions, right? Chariots and stuff to glorify the king. Fascinatingly, and we'll get to this in a second, it says all of these horses and chariots come from a particular place, Egypt. Now again, this is subtle, and you would just miss this if you're going along, but all this talk, remember the last 2 weeks, what do we connect the building of the temple to? The Exodus, remember? The storyteller was always connecting the building of the temple to the Exodus story, which is God delivering Israel out of Egypt to be their own nation, and now they're going back into Egypt to gather these things. The Exodus was where God destroyed horses and chariots that pursued Israel, and now Israel is amassing them for themselves, for the splendor of Solomon. The bounty of the land, which used to glorify the God who was the real king, the real leader of the people, is now all directed towards the glory and the splendor of King Solomon himself. A dynamic shift has taken place in the heart of Solomon. He is no longer a steward of God's bounty. He is entitled to it. And that is a definitive heart transformation in the wrong direction. But it's not just about amassing, so you can see if he's amassing wealth and power and horses and chariots, right along with that is what? Amassing women, right? Because the ancient kings, that's what they did to show who they were. And listen, my guess is all 1,000 of these women weren't, coming on The Bachelor and fawning over the king, right? These aren't love story, and hint, The Bachelor isn't a love story either, by the way. How many of those relationships work out, right? These aren't women who are fawning over the king and like dying to be with him. This is a king who's conquering, right? This is not, there's a whole bunch of not good stuff going on in there we can only imagine. 1,000 of them. Fascinating. So he's amassing wealth and power, but it's not just that. He is basking in the praise and recognition of others, right? So we turn now to the story of the visit of the Queen of Sheba. And I need to say a couple of things about this before we jump into this. The first is, the way I'm reading this story, you could say, I don't think that's true, because it's not inherent in there. I'm reading the story the way I'm reading it because it's dropped right in the middle of this whole section. And I can definitively tell you what I just said is meant to look negative on Solomon. And I can definitively tell you what happens before the Queen of Sheba is meant to look negative on Solomon. And so I'm reading that this also is part of the storyteller's effort to say, here's what's leading Solomon astray. Now, I could be off, and you could make a case for that. And in many ways, the story of the Queen of Sheba is somewhat nebulous in that way. Actually, the one who maybe gets it right in the story of the Queen of Sheba is the Queen of Sheba, not Solomon, because she's the one in the middle who says, your God is great. If you have this, your God is great. Now, Solomon doesn't say that, right? It's meant to be that the foreign kings and queens come and see that, and the king points them towards the true God, but she sees it for who it is. It says she brings all of these things to him. She's heard about his grandeur. She brings all these things to him. She sees his power, his might, all of his servants. She sees his wisdom. She plays, old school Jeopardy with them, it says. She asks all these questions. She tries to trick him, and he answers all these questions. He performs for her, right? She answers all of them. And it says, literally, if you translate the Hebrew literally, it says, he took her breath away. Right? He performed in a way that took her breath away. And so she gave him, it says, no more spices had been seen in Israel since that day or something like that. She adorned him with spices, which if you ever want to adorn me with anything, I'll take something other than spices, but it's going to be all right. I guess spices were a big deal back then. Anyway, I apologize. So he adorns with spices, but then there's this interesting little sentence at the very end of it. It says, and Solomon gave her whatever she asked for, beyond even his own bounty. Now, can we read into that a little bit? I think so. I can't be certain, but I think there's in essence some kind of quid pro quo, or some kind of sense in which her elaborate praise of Solomon extends him towards her, and he gives her whatever he wants, even beyond what would be just his royal bounty to give. So what is that beyond that he's giving? I think we're meant to read this not in a negative way towards the Queen of Sheba, but perhaps in a negative way towards Solomon, where Solomon is basking in the praise of others. He's finding his identity in his performance and in what other people say about him, not in the God who has bestowed on him these good and right gifts. What leads to amassing all kinds of things? Because when someone finds your value in what you've already amassed, what do you want to do? Amass more and more and more and more, right? Till all of a sudden you're amassing 666 of something. But we have to go even further back than the story of the Queen of Sheba, and now we're tracking all the way back into 1 Kings chapter 9. And what we find here is that Solomon actually begins to value himself above all of his people, all of the Israelites. And this was a warning given to the kings not to do. And how do we know this? Because Solomon does two particular things. The first is at the end of chapter 9, he conscripts, right, tens of thousands of Israelites to do his work. If you don't know what the word conscripts means, it means like drafts them. He comes knocking on the door and says, you serve me now, right? This isn't, again, a job application with a yes. This is a plucking out of their lives and saying, now you're with me. And of course, this is exactly what God warned the Israelites about their kings possibly doing through the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel. And here Solomon is doing it. And what is he doing it for? To build all kinds of cities, to fight in armies, and to be his servants and serve in his administration. He's conscripting his people, employing them for his protection and comfort rather than serving them for their protection and comfort. Something has happened here. And then if we go all the way back closer to the beginning of chapter 9, there's this strange interaction with the king of Tyre, Hiram. Remember Hiram? He's the guy that was sending all of this cedars and golds and stuff to help build the temple in Solomon's palace. And it's like, oh, and Solomon's, remember in the beginning was like, and Solomon gave him food. And we're like, well, that's a good trade. Well, it turns out there was more to the deal. Imagine that, right? And the storyteller lets us know what's going on here. Listen to what he says. He says, King Solomon gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, king of Tyre, because Hiram had supplied him with all the cedar and juniper and gold he wanted. Fascinating, isn't it? That what Solomon gave this king is Israelite towns. Now imagine living in one of those towns and being traded for gold and cedar to build the king's palace. How do you trade towns? Well, in ancient trade and kingdoms, these would have been border towns, somewhere along the border, and so the Israelite border shrinks, the border of Tyre grows, but you go from living in the land of promise under your God to living under a different king out of the land of promise given to other gods, not by your own decision, but by a king who decides it for you so he can adorn his own palace. Yowzers. What's more, listen to this. It goes on in verse 12. But when Hiram went from Tyre to see the town Solomon had given him, he was not pleased with them. What kind of towns are these you've given me, my brother? He asked. And he called them the land of Kabul. Kabul in Hebrew means good for nothing. A name they have to this day. Well, Hiram has that view. Why? Because Solomon has that view. Solomon views these towns as insignificant, and they're therefore easily enough to trade off for a bigger throne and a crazy number of shields in his palace. This ought to stun us. Way before the story of 1,000 foreign wives, something has already happened in Solomon's heart. He's amassed wealth and power because he's finding identity in the praise of others and has lifted himself above his fellow people. In summary, Solomon has shifted glory from God to himself. We have this picture of the glory of God descending upon the temple, moving Solomon to his knees in worship, and the very next chapter, Solomon is up on his feet in power, sitting on his own throne, receiving the worship of others. There has been a dynamic shift, and misplaced glory leads to misplaced priorities. Do you know what this shift is called in biblical terms? Pride. There's a word for this. It's the word pride. Pride happens when instead of worshiping God, we grab for divine status for ourselves. Now, we would never overtly say that's what we're doing. I'm not trying to be God. Well, yeah, but you kind of are. Right? Instead of being the conduit of God's blessing, we hold on to the blessing for ourselves, find our value in the blessing, procure more of it so others will see, and therefore find value therein. That is glory, one of the great questions of 1 Kings is for the readers, is glory found, is weight found, is value found in a God who would dwell amongst his people? Or is it found in yourself dwelling amongst your peers? That's a profound question for modern day America, where anyone who's being honest would say, it's actually found in me dwelling amongst my peers. That's why we're comparing ourselves to everyone all of the time, because the false gospel, we believe, tells us that's where we find our value. And the thing that you're better at than everyone else, keep amassing that thing. And then when people tell you about it, and you own it, and it leads to misplaced priorities, and therefore you go after wrong loves because they're feeding into that reality, and then all of a sudden wrong loves lead to wrong worship, lead to wrong obedience, and all of a sudden you have not just a God who's come to dwell amongst you, but a bunch of hills with a bunch of altars to foreign gods. See, Solomon is no different than you and me, is he? In fact, Solomon, the wisest of all men, most people would believe to be the writer of the book of Proverbs, writes this in Proverbs chapter 16. You know this. Pride goes before destruction. A prideful or haughty spirit before the fall, right? In modern parlance, pride goes before the fall, right? You've heard that phrase a million times in your life. There it is. Who's writing this? Is he writing it after the fact, in the middle of the fact, before the fact? We're not certain, but he's aware of it, and he's living it. Amazing. And so we are wrong if we do not pause and ask ourselves challenging questions this morning and going forward. In my life, where is there misplaced glory? Where am I not glorying in the God who descended to live amongst us, namely in Jesus? And instead, finding my glory, identity, value in my performance or in my amassing amongst my peers. But friends, it goes even deeper. Because we have to ask ourselves the question, where does pride come from? You say, well, that's just naturally human. Well, it's naturally broken humanity. But where does pride come from? It does actually come from somewhere. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum or by accident. Pride comes from somewhere. And here's where we want to jump out of 1 Kings and go even further back to the book of Deuteronomy. And as I read these verses in Deuteronomy, hopefully it's now going to come into full view why all of these chapters have to be read together. All right? So Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is instructions to the people of Israel through Moses from God about the future. And before it gets to this verse, it says, hey, there's going to come a time when you're going to want a king. Okay, have a king, but make sure he's an Israelite, first of all, and make sure the king does these things. Here we go. The king, moreover, must not acquire a great number of horses from himself or make the people return to Egypt to get them. Strike one. Right? For the Lord has said, you are not to go back that way again. He goes on. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Uh-oh. Strike two. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Strike three. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of his law, taken from that of the Levitical priest. Fine. He goes on. It is to be with him. He's to read it all the days of his life, so he may learn to revere the Lord as God and follow carefully all the words of his law and these decrees. Good. Verse 20. And he's not to consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. Oh boy. If there was such a thing as strike four, there it is, right? And turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Well, Solomon gets this all wrong. And therefore, if you're back with us next week, the kingdom is taken away from Solomon. But I really read fast through the reason that pride happens. I read verse 18 and 19 super fast. Let's go back and read it again. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of the law taken from the Levitical priests. Now, we hear a ton about the palace of Solomon. We hear a lot about the throne of Solomon. We know where the gold and the cedar and the ivory comes from. You know what is strangely missing from that throne room? The story of Solomon writing a copy of the law under the direction of the priests. It goes on, verse 19. It's to be with him. He is to read it all the days of his life. Take that as every single day. So that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of the law and these decrees. Do you hear what is said in this? He may learn to worship God. That his worship is something we grow in. It does not necessarily come naturally to the broken human being. And the way we grow in worship is to have the glory of God continually in front of us so that we are meditating on it day and night, every day of life. Where does pride come from? Pride comes when the worship of God is removed. When the image of God, when the reality of God is out of sight, pride lurks and grows. And when pride grows, we view others as less than ourselves, or we're jealous of those we view who are better than ourselves, and so we seek the praise of man, and we amass whatever we have to do to find identity, and it leads to foreign loves that lead us in all kinds of ways. The Hebrew there is actually, it bends our heart away from God. What did Solomon actually get wrong in all of these stories? Well, you can look at the fruit of what he got wrong and say, well, he married the wrong kinds of people and he did the wrong kinds of things. Those are the weeds that are above the ground, right? And if you don't get the root, those doggone weeds grow back again. And what is the root? Pride. And why does pride grow? Because the worship of God is missing. The glory of God is out of sight. He's not learning and growing in revering God. Friends, so too for us. Sin, rebellion, disobedience, let alone massive collapse, does not happen in a vacuum. You don't stumble into it. It's not by chance. In your heart is festering darkness. It's called the flesh. And it is working in opposition to God. And therefore, where you are not cultivating worship to God, you are, in fact, cultivating pride. It is not a field devoid of seed. And where pride is allowed to be cultivated, all kinds of misplaced glory will lead to misplaced priorities. And all kinds of misplaced priorities will lead to foreign loves. And all kinds of foreign loves will lead to foreign influence and idolatry. But the way out of that is just as easily attainable. And by easily, I mean the way to do it is easy to know, hard to do, right? So don't mishear me. Because you work it backwards. Why did this happen in my life? Why am I continuing to struggle in this area of sin in my life? Well, where is the foreign love? Identify it. And then underneath the foreign love, where is the misplaced priority? And underneath the misplaced priority, where is the misplaced glory? And underneath the misplaced glory, why is pride growing in my life? Why is it taking root? And when you're down there underneath the soil of your heart, that's where the gospel hits and transforms. Because if you get a true picture of God that is only found in the glory of Jesus, God who came to dwell amongst us, who has loved us so profoundly that he defeated sin and death on the cross, was raised to life to give new creation life to all things. What greater glory is there than that? And has called you his own, has welcomed you to the family. That's who you are. When you apply that to the root and you grow and tend that in your heart, you cultivate worship. You learn to revere God. And it crushes pride. But in our broken human gardens, both are growing. So how will you tend your soul?